It's now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Mark Hanis for him, stopping genocide began as an extracurricular activity while he was at Swarthmore College. Together with a group of other fellow students, Mark set up the Genocide Intervention Fund to raise money to help support peacekeepers in Sudan and to inspire policymakers to take effective action. This fund, in fact, grew into the Genocide Intervention Fund, which is now on the ground in places such as Darfur, northern Darfur, where they have developed projects that provide protection for women and girls in refugee camps, protection against gender-based violence. They're also expanding to have programs in such places as Burma and other trouble spots around the world where atrocities are occurring. And they've created a student anti-genocide coalition that has more than 800 chapters, not just in the United States, but around the world. So please do ask him about that. He's here to talk about his vision of empowering individuals to stop genocide once and for all. So please join me in welcoming Mark Hanis.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for coming tonight. What I wanted to do in half an hour or less, so we can make sure we have plenty of time for questions, is talk about three pieces of news. The first news is the bad news of what's going on today in Darfur, Sudan. Second news is the good news of what Americans in particular have done in response to this genocide, the first genocide of the 21st century. And then the third news is the exciting news of what each and every one of you can do more, if you're already taking action, to help stop this genocide. So briefly, just so people understand, because it's often used inaccurately, is the term genocide. This came about when Winston Churchill was visiting the concentration camps in Europe during World War II and was interviewed by the BBC and asked to describe what he was seeing to the British public. And he was struggling because he couldn't just say lots of people were murdered, lots of people were killed, and really accurately depicts the horrendous crimes that the Nazis had done. So he was honest, and he said, "I'm witnessing a crime without a name." And this Polish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, heard about this and had seen what had happened during Armenia, had experienced some of the pogroms with his family, and came up with this term called genocide, or race murder. And it has a specific definition, which is the intent to destroy a group of people in whole or in parts based on specific characteristics. And it's section C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction in whole or in parts, on why the United States government, for the first time ever in history, has declared a conflict of genocide. And often there is debates, as you all know, whether something's a genocide or not, and many people are still debating previous conflicts, like previous genocides, like the Armenian genocide, whether that was one or not. So briefly, because I'm assuming all of you are very familiar with the conflict, Sudan is the largest country in Africa. It borders 9 other countries, and this is the country zoomed in. And Sudan is about the size of the United States east of the Mississippi. It is huge. And Darfur is chapter 3 of a series of atrocities that the Sudanese government is committing on its own people. First in the Nuba Mountains, and then it moved down to the southern part of the country, which most people are familiar with because of the lost boys and girls of Sudan. Many of those were the refugees from the conflict, the civil war between the north and the south. And then most recently in 2003, the government started exterminating its people, specifically the non-Arab tribes in the western part of the country in Darfur. Darfur is the size of Texas or France. Take your pick. It is just an extremely large landmass, so that's why it is such a complex situation, because it is so large and it's in one of the least accessible areas in the world to allow for people to have easy access to help the civilians being targeted. So the first part of the news is, other than the genocide, is that the situation is getting worse. Similar to our failure to prevent Hitler from from going beyond Germany and expanding because of our failure. He's expanded throughout Europe. We saw the same thing in Rwanda, expanding into eastern Congo. The genocide in Darfur is now expanded into eastern Chad and the Central African Republic. So while we still call it the Darfur genocide, it's no longer accurate because it's now gone from that one region in one country to now a region in the continent. And how is this genocide committed? Well, basically the government of Sudan uses the Air Force and flies over the villages of three main tribes. The Fur, in Darfur means the land of the Fur, the Zagawa, and the Masalits. These are mostly non-Arab tribes. And it just bombs these villages to smithereens, where you would once see a village, think it's on a map, and then visit it afterwards, and it's completely destroyed. And again, that's part of the definition on why the U.S. has called this a genocide. And many times the Sudanese government denies it has a role in it, but when you still find unexploded munition, no other actor other than the Sudanese government has control of the airspace. It is clearly complicit in this genocide, even though, as with previous genocide regimes, it continues to deny it and say this is some tribal conflict or internal disputes. This isn't something that we're doing. And again, you just see the total destruction of these villages where people have been forced to become refugees or internally displaced people. The second part, which is very similar to other genocides, is the creation of a militia. The Nazis created the SS. In Rwanda, they had the Interahamwe, the Hutu power. And in Darfur, they've got the Janjaweed militia. And these are largely composed of the Arab tribes. And they work hand in glove with the Sudanese government. So they often will surround the village when the Sudanese government sends its bombs, its gunships to bomb the villages. They're ready to capture and then kill, rape, or torture anyone who's been able to survive the bombing. So this is sort of the left and right hook. Since 2003, experts estimate between 300,000 to over 500,000 people have been exterminated and over 2.5 million people displaced. Huge numbers. The UN has called this the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And many times when we hear these numbers, we get dumbed down by them. We can't understand what these large numbers mean. And one of the best people who has written about the genocide in Darfur is a journalist for the New York Times, Nicholas Kristof. And he talks about the importance of telling the single narrative. So let me tell you this about one person who's been affected by this that was written about in the New York Times. And this is 14-year-old Halima Abdel Karim. Halima belongs to the Dajo tribe in eastern Chad, so she's not from Darfur. And because we have failed to stop this genocide when it started in Darfur, the Janjaweed crossed over into Chad and proceeded to kill most of the men and boys. And then they gathered all the women and children, and for 2 straight days they proceeded to gang rape them. 10 to 12 men, not just using their bodies, they're using guns, they're using knives, or they're using firewood to rape these women and children. And Halima at that time was 4 months pregnant and was being raped. After the 2 days of torture, they said, "Get lost, we're done with you." And Halima and her sister, because they were now orphaned after the Janjaweed had killed their parents, her sister was objected to leaving the camp without taking the donkey, because she was in charge of the donkey. And in that area, donkeys are part of their livelihood. It's used to plow the land or to carry the water from the well to the village. And because she objected, the Janjaweed shot her in the head and killed her. So Halima not just lost her parents, her family, but also her siblings. Fast forward 6 months, Halima is now in a refugee camp. And again, because we fail at following up the rhetoric of never again with action, the Janjaweed attack the refugee camp. And at that time, Halima had given birth to her toddler, and the Janjaweed threw the baby on the ground and said, "You will no longer have black babies, you will have Arab babies." And this is the dilemma that's still happening in Darfur. And this is just one story of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Darfuris that are being attacked, not in the late 1930s or early 1940s. This is happening as we all sit here today. This is happening in Sudan. And the important thing is that these people are not just one-time victims, they're being repeatedly victimized. So when you hear the numbers of victims and the numbers of displaced, these are usually repeat victims. And again, people, I often use the analogies of the Holocaust, which sometimes people have the image of conventional warfare, but in Darfur, this is extremely unconventional. Anytime you hear a village being bombed, which is still happening in the past weeks and months, these are the faces of the people that are being attacked. It's women and children. So the second part of the bad news is that this is, again, as I mentioned, the first time ever in history our government has called something a genocide. July 22nd, 2004, both houses of Congress, soon followed by then Secretary of State Colin Powell, using the G word. We've always avoided using the G word because we thought we had to do something about it. And unfortunately, since then, continuously, both President Bush and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice have continued to diagnose the conflict correctly, but have failed to apply the appropriate treatments to calling it a genocide. So the big myth of if you call it what it is, will then spur the appropriate action has just been blown to smithereens. That's no longer the assumption which many people thought since the creation of the Genocide Convention after the Holocaust. The other key, big component is, because people are still debating the term genocide, is since the Nuremberg trials, which prosecuted the Nazi war criminals, and we've since had tribunals in Rwanda and Yugoslavia, we've now got the International Criminal Courts. And the International Criminal Courts, in the past 2 months, has indicted the first sitting head of states, and they have indicted the president of Sudan for crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, as well as 2 other officials, Ahmed Haroun, who's a state official, and Ali Kushab, who belongs to the Janjaweed militia. This is a huge stepping stone where the international community is recognizing and trying to hold individuals accountable for the crime of genocide. The last part of the bad news is that, as we all know, Darfur is not the first time we have been confronted with a genocide and challenged to see if we can meet that challenge and overcome it. From the genocide in Armenia to the Holocaust, we've got this great saying of never again will we allow people to be systematically targeted for who they are. And yet it has happened again, whether it's Cambodia or Bosnia or Kosovo or Rwanda. It's now happening in Darfur. We've got the right diagnosis, and we're now past our 5th year into this. We're still not doing anywhere close to what it needs to happen to stop this genocide. There's this great scene that many people have seen in Hotel Rwanda, where Don Cheadle, who plays a hotel manager, walks up to the journalist Joaquin Phoenix, and he tells him the reason why Americans aren't taking action is simply because they don't know about it. It's just ignorance. If you get it on TV, if you put it on or before American Idol, Americans will get off their couches, they'll say we've got to do something about it, and we will end this genocide. Does anyone remember what the journalist says in response, what Joaquin Phoenix says in response? Does anyone remember this scene? Really critical, an important phrase. He says, "No, I think if people see this footage, they'll say, 'Oh my God, that's horrible,' and go back to eating their dinners." This is a huge, huge assumption, a huge myth that if you tell people about something, that they will act upon it. If you just tell them about the news, they'll take action, and that's a fundamental mistake because you need to go beyond just providing them information. You need to help them and show them how to take action. And this had a huge impact on me because when I first heard about Darfur, I was in the cafeteria with my friends, and we were reading a newspaper article, and this scene had a huge impact on me personally because 4 of my grandparents are Holocaust survivors. My mom's mom was an orphan when Hitler took over Austria, the Nazis took over Austria, and she and her brother were able to get refuge on the Kinder transports, which was a program the British government had to provide refuge to Jews only if they were 16 years and younger. So she made it to London and later made it up to Scotland, Glasgow, Scotland, and there she grew up, met and married another Holocaust survivor. They had 3 daughters. The middle one's my mom, who grew up in Glasgow, Scotland, has the very cool Scottish accent, so I can do all the lines from Braveheart and sound like a Scotsman. Like every man dies, but no one really lives. My dad's dad, and my mom left Scotland and came to the U.S. when she was 19 to L.A. to live the American dream. My dad's dad was in Auschwitz, and he tried to get refuge at the tail end here in the United States, but was denied entry. Tried Cuba, was denied entry, and eventually made his way to Quito, Ecuador in South America. And there he met another Holocaust survivor. They got married, had one son, my dad, who was born and raised in Ecuador. So si quieren, también puedo hablar en español. And so my dad met my mom, and they got married and raised my sister and I in Ecuador. So I grew up there for 18 years, belonged to the one synagogue in the country, a small Jewish community, about 100 Jewish families. And everyone was either a Holocaust survivor or descendant of a Holocaust survivor. And the elders who had been in the camps had the numbers tattooed on their arms. And they never wore long sleeves, so always they would remind everyone, especially the younger generation, about two things. One, never forget what happened during the Holocaust. Never forget the failure of the world to stop and help save the Jews from being exterminated. And two, and is equally important, never let it happen again. Never allow people, doesn't matter if they're Scottish, Ecuadorian, Jewish, never allow people to be targeted for who they are. So this was drilled into me, and clearly part of who I am, why I was born, why I was raised by a Scottish mom and Ecuadorian dad in Ecuador. And so when I graduated high school, I came to the United States to go to college, and then in the cafeteria, I was talking with my friends about Darfur. And instead of asking the question of should we do something, should we not do something, the question was so much simpler than that. It was, what can I do? What can I, as an average citizen, an average individual here in the United States, do to help stop the world's worst atrocity, to stop the first genocide of the 21st century? So, as good students, we didn't allow our schooling to interfere with our education. So we skipped class and we went to the library and tried to find more information, because we didn't know who the Janjaweed were, where Sudan was. Google and Wikipedia provided a lot of those answers. And then we also continued to do more research, and we came across an amazing book that won a Pulitzer Prize, and I encourage you all to read it. It's written by Samantha Power, and it's called A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. And what Samantha did was looked at all the genocides of the 20th century and asked the simple question, which was, what did the United States know, and what did it do or fail to do in response to these genocides? And we focused on three of her conclusions. I'm really big on threes, if you haven't noticed already. Three of her conclusions for why we have failed at stopping genocide and why we will continue to fail at stopping mass atrocities unless we change these three things. And the three things are protection, political will, and permanency. The protection part is fundamental in understanding why we fail and why we continue to fail. And that is when people hear about Darfur, they put it in their heads in the same bucket as the tsunami or Katrina. And that is by treating genocide like a natural disaster. And that is a huge problem, because all the atrocities, all the displaced people, all the malnutrition is all caused not by a tidal wave or a hurricane, it's all caused by other human beings. But because we treat it like a natural disaster, we respond to it like a natural disaster. And that's by donating to humanitarian aid organizations, Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, International Rescue Committee. And don't get me wrong, aid is necessary, and it's what's keeping people alive every day in Darfur. But if it's the bulk of our response, or the only response, it is just completely irresponsible. Can you imagine during World War II if Americans hearing about the Jews being shipped into the concentration camps and into the gas chambers would simply respond by giving them blankets and medicine and food and saying, that's it, I did my part to help save the Jews during the Holocaust. You know, fortunately, albeit late, we did more than that. We liberated them. We protected the Jews from the final solution. But when it comes to Darfur, we're throwing bags of rice in the face of genocide. Citizens and our governments, the bulk of what we're doing is simply throwing aid in response to genocide. And instead of treating genocide like a humanitarian crisis, we need to stop and start treating it like a security crisis. Focus on protection. Protecting civilians is the ultimate goal. The second P is political will. And in the book, she interviews over 300 American decision makers and asks them, what did you do? What did you know? Why did you fail to do anything? And they often use the same two excuses of we didn't know or we didn't have the ability to do anything. And in her book, she shows methodically with every single genocide of the 20th century we did know what was happening, and we had the capability to do things about it. We knew about the Jews in the ghettos. We knew about them building concentration camps. In Rwanda, we knew about the hate speech in the radio station, listing off Tutsis' names to go hack to death. And in Darfur, we have satellite images of the villages being bombed. So we've always known, and we've always had the ability to do something about it. Our Air Force and that of our allies were bombing the factories next to the railroad lines leading to the concentration camps, and we didn't bomb them. And we could have saved hundreds of thousands of Jews from being exterminated. In Rwanda, we could have blocked the radio station as they would hack people to death. You know, in Rwanda, in 1994, all of us in this room were alive. They killed close to 1 million people in 100 days. 1 million people in 100 days. To give you a scale of that, that's 2 9/11s every day for 100 days. And what did we all do? Nothing. And they weren't using sophisticated equipment, Tomahawk missiles or F-14s. They were using machetes, or farming tools, to slaughter these people in 1994. And we didn't do anything. We could have done more. And in Darfur, we could also stop these. They aren't using sophisticated equipment. A lot of these people are child soldiers that are committing these atrocities. So the question is why? Why does the world's most powerful government continue to fail at making never again mean something? And the answer is simple. The answer is this. There is zero political cost to inaction in the face of genocide. There is not one person who will ever run for government or for public office, whether that's for governor, state legislator, Congress, for presidency of the United States, and will ever lose a vote or a campaign dollar for doing nothing in the face of genocide. But it's interesting because they do it on other issues. Immigration, abortion, gun rights, the environment, senior citizen rights. On all these other issues, Americans get more than educated, they get political. They demand action from their public officials and use votes and campaign contributions to leverage their concern for it. Our favorite example is the woman Terry Schiavo, the one with the feeding tube in Florida. You know, Americans got more than educated. They picked up the phone, they got an email, they went to the office of their public officials and they said, do something about this. And you know what? They responded. Congress held special sessions till midnight, special sessions on Sunday. In fact, to write a piece of legislation for one woman, Congress pulled all-nighters to write a piece of legislation. President Bush, who's known to enjoy his vacation time, cut his vacation short from his ranch in Texas, flew back to the Oval Office to be ready, waiting to sign a piece of legislation for one woman. But where hundreds of thousands of people have died and continue to die in Darfur or in other areas, whether it's Burma or Congo or Sri Lanka, we're really good at having the rhetoric. It's so much easier to denounce these atrocities than it actually is to do anything about it. And until we get political about stopping genocide, we will continue to fail at making never again mean anything about it. And the third piece tied right into that, and that is somehow we're naive enough to believe the rhetoric when they say after every genocide, never again will we allow this to happen. Civil society, citizens, we all buy it hook, line, and sinker. So we created the War Refugee Board during World War II, and after speeches never again, poof, it dissolved. And then came the American campaign to save Bosnia. And after the speech of never again, poof, it dissolved. And now we've got the Save Darfur coalition for Darfur, and hopefully it'll stay around longer. But its mission is just to focus right now on Darfur. Instead, when you look at any other issue, if you look at any other issue, they've got permanent institutions ready to prevent or respond to whenever their issue comes up. But Samantha showed in her research that there is no grassroots domestic political organization that is always there to help to protect and defend human rights worldwide. So she said, in vulgar terms, creates the NRA for human rights. So as we continue to skip more class, we came across another great book, and this was a report called The Responsibility to Protect, or R2P. And this came about when Kofi Annan went to the General Assembly after the Rwandan genocide and said, we are failures. We're going to become another League of Nations if we can't stop things like Rwanda. That's what we were created for, to stop things like that, and we failed. Because every time we want to intervene for humanitarian reasons, the country comes back and says, whoa, 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 sovereignty, sovereignty, this is an internal issue, stay out of our business. So he asked the UN for help, member countries, and the Canadian government said, we will try to help you. So they created a commission, and the commission interviewed world leaders, academics, nonprofit, non-governmental organizations saying, how do we overcome this challenge? And after a year, they produced this report called The Responsibility to Protect. And it totally changes the way we look at international relations with regard to mass atrocities. And what it says is sovereignty is no longer ultimate. If a country is unwilling or unable to protect its citizens, that sovereignty is waived, and the international community now has permission to intervene. And 2 years ago, they had the largest congregation of world leaders at the UN, and they produced a World Summit document, and they endorsed the responsibility to protect. So this is just happening in the last 2 years that we're now seeing this new paradigm of international relations when it comes to mass atrocities. It breaks down in more specifics, and I'll save that for more questions and answers because I want to end sooner rather than later. But my sister's a 4th grade teacher in the Bronx, and she hears me talk about how cool Responsibility to Protect is, or R2P. I said it rocks my world. And she wants to talk to her students about it. So she uses the final episode of Seinfeld, which overwhelmingly the majority of Americans have seen. And there's a scene where the main characters are watching this guy getting his car stolen. And the guy's asking for help. And the main characters, Kramer is shooting video of this incident, and the car is stolen. And a police officer walks up to the characters and he says, "You're under arrest." And they're like, "Why? I didn't steal the car. We weren't accomplices. We didn't help the thief steal the car. Why are we responsible?" And he said, does anyone remember? Yes, he said, "You violated the Good Samaritan law." And this is basically, in a simplification, what Responsible to Protect is. It's basically saying to take the Good Samaritan law to an international level. Even though the United States is not committing genocide, even though we're not aiding and abetting the Sudanese government to commit genocide, we still have a responsibility to protect citizens or civilians when their government is unwilling or unable to. Okay, so fast forward, 4 of us barely graduated. We moved to Washington, D.C. For those of us who could, we grew facial hair so it'd be taken seriously. And we created the Genocide Intervention Network. And our mission is to answer that question that all of you are or have asked when you heard about Darfur and said, what can I do about it? We said we want to create an organization to answer that question. So when the average American says, how can I help, or any American says, or anyone says, how can I help, we've come up with the 3 most effective tools we think every single one of you can use to help stop genocide. And the best part is that they rhyme. It's educate, advocate, and donate. So the education part is simple. If you can't stop a genocide, if you don't know about a genocide, you can't stop it. And so that's why World Affairs Council, Holocaust Museum, other organizations are out there raising awareness about this so no one can ever say, which they have said in the past with other genocides, I didn't take action because I didn't know about it. We never want to hear that excuse. So we started creating student chapters, and we've created over 1,000 student chapters in the United States and abroad. There's also specific things. We've got a website, we've got a speakers bureau, so that Holocaust or genocide survivors and other experts can speak about the issue to churches, synagogues, mosques, Rotary clubs, anyone who will who will take someone to speak about the issue. They're available. There's been several movies about the issue. Most recently, Darfur Now, which is on Amazon, follows 6 people who have done work in regards to Darfur, including the prosecutor from the International Criminal Courts, Don Cheadle and George Clooney, in case that excites any of you even more to watch it, and one of my colleagues who's working on divestment, which I'll get to. There's also a great book written by Don Cheadle and John Prendergast called Not in Our Watch that talks about what people are doing around the country in response to this genocide. I'm going to skip through this as an online action and get to the sweet spot on the baseball bat to hit a home run on abolishing genocide, and that is advocacy. How do we build the political will to stop genocide? And we've spent a lot of time thinking about this and talking to a lot of experts and looking at other groups, NRA, Focus on the Family, Move On, how do they do it? And so what we did was we've created one tool, and that is we've created the first report card for every member of Congress on how they've voted, how they've co-sponsored on legislation regarding Darfur. Have they been to Darfur? Have they held a town hall meeting in their own district about Darfur? Anything related to Darfur in the past 5 years, and gave them a letter grade, A through F, and created a website, Darfur Score, so anyone can go to this website to see what their member of Congress has earned and what they need to do to get a better grade. And people have flooded their members of Congress. We've got great stories, but I'll just tell you one, where Senator Cornyn from Texas had had a D or an F for voting no or not voting on any Darfur bill. And Texans, from students to teachers to faith leaders to business executives, were emailing him and writing letters to the Houston Chronicle shaming Senator Cornyn for doing nothing on Darfur, that he called our office and said, I want to help write the most robust bill on Sudan to date. So we worked with his staff and we wrote the Sudan Accountability and Divestment Acts. And in November, both houses of Congress passed the bill. And on December 31st, President Bush signed the bill into law. Why was this possible? Not because of me. I live in D.C. I have no member of Congress. It was because of people like you who are willing to get political about stopping genocide and pressure their public servants to do more than just talk about it. And we've had remarkable increase in grades from over 21 reps in 2006, 66 more representatives have increased their grades from Ds and Fs to Bs and up to As. In the Senate, we've also had from 10 in 2006 to now 7 this past year increasing their grades. So they're feeling the heat already from Americans across the country pressuring them to get better grades. I just put up the scorecard for your congressional delegation. They're doing pretty darn good, pretty darn well. They could help lead by example with some of their colleagues who don't have as good grades. So that's something you guys should be proud of. Another big tool is targeted divestment, and the logic is it costs money to commit genocide. Sudanese government requires foreign direct investments to finance the genocide in Darfur. It does this with European and Asian oil companies, mostly oil and energy sector, to purchase the military hardware to exterminate a group of people. So we started doing a divestment campaign, learning the lessons from the divestment campaign against apartheid South Africa, during the apartheid regime, and learned the best practices and created a much more targeted surgical model. And started at the college level. We've now gotten 54 colleges to divest. And then we said, why stop here? So we started writing state legislation to get the states' pension systems to divest from these companies that are financing this genocide. And our first was with all students from the UC system, successfully getting Governor Schwarzenegger to divest CalSTRS and CalPERS. And we hired Adam, who was in the green T-shirt. He grew a beard, which was a requirement, came to our office in D.C., and we introduced this bill in as many other states around the country. And to date, New Hampshire has become the 27th state to pass targeted divestment legislation. And this, again, was possible because, for example, 3 high schoolers in Kansas used their spring break to get the Kansas legislator to divest. Or 2 women in Minnesota successfully got the state of Minnesota to divest. This isn't people who are well-connected, billionaires, or have Oprah Winfrey on their speed dial. These are, common people doing extraordinary things by getting political to stopping genocide. We sent one of our staff members to travel to initiate divestment campaigns across the world. So I think we've got 27 countries to date that are starting divestment campaigns. For those that who don't have the moral compass in the economic sector, we have done research with Bloomberg and shown that those peer companies that don't do business in Sudan are actually getting higher returns. So if you're not going to divest because of moral reasons, there's now concrete economic reasons for why investing in genocide won't get you high returns. And with this market, this should be good news to not invest in genocide. The last tool is the most exciting tool, and that's one that each and every one of you has on you right now, and that is your cell phone. We have created the anti-genocide hotline called 1-800-GENOCIDE. So I usually ask people to spend time dialing it in, but we're going to cut through that. But if you dial 1-800-GENOCIDE, you're asked to enter your 5-digit zip code, and our system will then identify your representative, your senators, or give you the option to call the White House. Whatever option you pick, we will give you the specific action item that public official needs to take, and then we connect you for free to that office so that you can tell them specifically as a constituent what they can do. It takes 2 minutes or less. It's the 911 of stopping genocide, and we've had huge results from creating this. This was just compiled most recently. We've had now over 16,000 people call their public officials, and we've seen results where members of Congress are saying, please get people to stop calling me. I'll do whatever it takes. And we've created this website to make it easier for you to share with friends and family, 1-800-genocide.com. Pretty easy to remember. The last tool is protection. And that is, we said, aid, good, important, necessary, but we want to focus on protection. So we recognize, as unfortunately is the case worldwide, peacekeeping missions are always under-resourced and underfunded. So we decided that any money we would raise, in addition to supporting our other efforts, would go towards supporting protection projects on the ground. So we decided to support the African Union peacekeepers, they're now UN peacekeepers, to help them be more effective on the ground. And we asked people across the country, just raise as much money as possible. And people would come up with amazingly creative ways, from students at Cornell showing Hotel Rwanda raising $5,000, or students in Florida doing salsa for Sudan. They taught salsa lessons. Or fraternities putting a bucket next to the kegs of beer, calling it Drink for Darfur, and raising several $1,000s. People would just come up with amazing ways, and even non-students were taking action. A pastor in Salt Lake City gave a sermon about Darfur, and a piano teacher walked up to her and said, the next 2 weeks of my proceeds, I want to go to help protect people in Darfur. So to date, we've raised over $500,000 to supporting peacekeeping efforts in Darfur. And one of the projects, we've had 3, again, no surprise with the 3, and that is this dilemma where women and children need to collect firewood to cook the raw food that we're good at giving them. But there's no outreach components that this under-resourced peacekeeping mission has. So we hired and funded a non-governmental organization on the ground to serve as a coordinating entity between the peacekeepers and the women, so that they could successfully be protected with peacekeepers to collect firewood and return back safely. The other thing, in some camps, there is no firewood anymore within the vicinity. So they now have trucks that go out and collect the firewood and return, and they sell it. So we've shifted some of our funding to income-generating activities, so that they can, we've given them livestock, so they can sell the eggs, the milk, the meat, so that they can purchase the firewood. So this is what we're also doing. Most recently, we've been talking a lot to the peacekeeping mission, and the police units of the peacekeeping mission don't have standard rules of engagement, a standard training manual. So we hired a SWAT officer from Texas who had served in peacekeeping missions in Bosnia to develop a standard training manual to better train police officers in Darfur, because it was going to take the State Department or NATO about 6 months to do it. We felt we played a good niche where we had the money, small amounts, and be able to rapidly distribute it to be able to do things like this. So the thing that ties it all together, the permanency, is creating the first permanent anti-genocide constituency. We've got our stand chapters for students. We've asking people to become GINet members. It's free. You give us your name, your email, and your zip code, and you can sign up. And so what does a GINet member and anti-genocide activist look after hearing my long talk on the soapbox? Well, it's like Homer with his anti-genocide tool belts and his anti-genocide tools. And that includes Samantha Power's book, so he understands the context of genocide, his congressional scorecard, his members must be from California, his portfolio to make sure he's not invested in genocide, his cell phone to call 1-800-GENOCIDE, his wad of cash to give to protection, and a clipboard to recruit 10 other people to become members of the anti-genocide constituency. So in summation, the exciting thing that people just don't seem to get easily, which I'll beat it with a dead horse, or beat the dead horse, is each and every one of you can have a hand in stopping genocide. You don't have to have a PhD in genocide studies. You don't have to be a Pulitzer Prize winner or be an aid worker on the ground. Each of you can have a huge impact. I started with a friend in a cafeteria, and we've been able to have huge impact because of people like you around the country getting political and using the 3 tools of educate, advocate, and donate. So specifics, since you're all eager to get up from your chairs and help stop this genocide, here are some. Become a member of GINet, watch Darfur Now, or show a screening in your house. Make sure your members of Congress are all getting A+. Make sure you're divesting and donate to support anti-genocide efforts, whether that's supporting World Affairs Council to hold events like this, which cost money, so that people become more aware of it, supporting the operational organizations like International Rescue Committee or Doctors Without Borders. It costs money to stop genocide, and so any bit helps. We've got a campaign that I'll talk about at the end for the candidates called AskTheCandidates.org, where we've got a questionnaire that all the candidates, or the last 2 candidates that we've put, have their answers in response to Darfur. So it makes it easy. We've got sample questions in case they ever come to your districts that you can ask them questions that'll put them on the record for stopping Darfur. I just wanted to highlight that there are already amazing upstanders in your own community. From Jane, we've got students that are part of STAND. We've got activists. There are already some Sudanese that live in San Francisco that are taking action. I was going to go into each of them, but it's exciting to know that there are people already in San Francisco who are taking leadership roles in stopping this genocide, and they're eager to have you join them. So thank you very much.
I have questions that fall into a few categories, Mark. The first group has to do with Darfur itself. The second has to do with other cases. Third is about responsibility to protect and how that is operationalized. And finally, the questions are about policy, but maybe that will change. With respect to Darfur itself, we had a number of questions that asked whether what the ideology of the conflict is to begin with. One questioner asked, is this Darfur genocide religious-based, Muslims versus non-Muslims? Is this about theology, or is this about identity, or is this about politics?
Sure, great question. It's a longer answer, but the gist of what's happening in Darfur, unlike what happened in the South, which was mostly a religious base, is that this is mostly tribal. It's mostly Arab, targeting, as a perpetrators, non-Arabs. And it's mostly tribal. The important thing is that both the victims and the perpetrators are all Muslim, which wasn't the case in southern Sudan, and it's important to separate the two. But I think the bottom line is there is no rationale for committing genocide. We should never try to rationalize and be like, oh, it makes sense for a government to try to exterminate a group of people. There are some just evil people, as there was Hitler's and Pol Pot's. Bashir and his cohort are not doing anything that is rational as a response. They try to justify it by holding on to power. And they hold on to power through dividing and conquering their own population. So they pit different groups against each other so that those people fight against each other instead of focusing their attention on a completely irresponsible, illegitimate government. And so that's how they rationalize it. Instead of quelling a rebellion, which took 21 years in the South, and their initial response in Darfur, they figured drain the swamp to kill the fish. So instead of just going after the rebels in Darfur who attacked a government post, let's just wipe out the entire population in Darfur. So I hope that helps.
What is the interplay between what happens in Chad and what happens in Darfur? You noted that the conflict is spilling over, but to what degree does President Deby of Chad support rebels in Sudan, and to what degree does Bashir support rebels in Chad?
There's a lot of proxy wars in this region. Part of it was colonialism, drawing lines without being cognizant of who the people were when those borders were drawn. The president of Chad is a Zagawa. He belongs to one of the tribes that are being targeted in Darfur. And so he has provided a lot of financial and other supports to the Zagawa tribes. And in Sudan, they're trying to overthrow the Chadian government. So they often will send the Janjaweed or its government forces to try to overthrow Deby. So there's a very adversarial relationship where they're trying to overthrow each other. And somewhat within this war, there's the extermination of individuals. So it's a complex situation. It's complex and complicated, but again, the solution is simple: protect civilians. And so there needs to be a lot of peace negotiations between the internal groups in Sudan, as well as amongst regional actors.
On the protect civilians side, you noted that peacekeepers are on the ground, and there were a series of questions in here about about peacekeeping, about its efficacy, and about its future. I think probably question number one was, why is this peacekeeping mission so underfunded, so under-resourced, and why did the U.S., for example, why have they been unable to find helicopters?
Yeah.
Which was a big issue for a long time.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of where to start this. So the UN is a club of member countries, and many times it's easy for countries to blame the UN or to set it up as a straw man and say, well, it's being ineffective, therefore we can't do anything about it. Samantha Power says it's like blaming, if the Knicks lose, it's as absurd as blaming the Madison Square Garden for their loss. Blaming the UN is the failure of the UN and its agencies or peacekeeping missions is because they're not set up to succeed. So, for example, in the case of Darfur, most experts say you need, and it's been approved by resolution, you need 26,000 peacekeepers. We've currently got 9,000 peacekeepers. And in the area of France, that's just, you can't succeed when there's only 9,000 of you. And when you don't have equipments to succeed, they don't have the jeeps or the walkie-talkies or the helicopters because member countries don't provide them, then they can't get around and they can't go and protect civilians. So what's needed to make this succeed is to get from the 9,000 to 26,000, and that requires countries from both Africa and outside of Africa to pledge troops. It requires that the mandates, which is a Chapter 7 mandate to proactively protect, which was one of the problems in Rwanda, they didn't have that robust mandate, is being realized on the ground, and that there's a peace process that complements it. The peacekeepers eventually need to keep the peace, and when there's no ceasefire that can hold, it just makes them part of it unfortunately gets them more involved in the conflicts than what their mission was intended to do, is to bring about parties to find a peaceful political solution to this.
And what is your position, if your organization has a position, on the question of military force for peacemaking purposes? That is to say, a military intervention for humanitarian reasons to prevent or stop a mass atrocities.
Yeah, so the answer we have on the role of military intervention for mass atrocities is what the Responsibility to Protect says. And that is, it has criteria on when to consider military engagement. And some of those criteria include last resort. It also includes proportional means. No one's calling to use nuclear weapons in Darfur. That's not a proportional response. Likelihood to succeed. So there's all these criteria, and that's how we at GINet and I would say the majority of the Darfur movement sees this, is that we use it as a last resort, and if we do use it, we set it up to succeed and not to fail.
Is there a risk that the peacekeeping mission, that the effect of this peacekeeping mission being under-resourced and therefore unable to succeed will discredit the whole concept of peacekeeping?
Yeah, I'd say there's unfortunately many other case studies that this peacekeeping mission Darfur is not going to change that perception. I think people, rightfully so, have a really frustrated perception on UN peacekeeping. In Rwanda, they didn't have the equipment either. They didn't even have paper and pencils. I'm reading the book that Romeo Dallaire wrote, the lieutenant general, to report how many people were being killed, to know how many soldiers he should deploy, because the bureaucracy at the UN didn't allow them to order papers and pencils in time. It's just absurd. And so there's no question that peacekeeping is not being as effective as it could be. Our answer is, instead of giving up on it, is to invest in it, make it succeed. Just as if there's a student or a child who is doing poorly in school, you don't say, all right, drop out or give up. You help them. You help them succeed, and that's what we try to do with both our advocacy and our funding, is to support them where we can to help them succeed.
This questioner asks what we can do to create pressures on, for example, China. You talked about the fact that it takes money to commit genocide. China remains deeply invested in Sudan. Are there pressure points post the Olympics?
Yeah. Great question, because as everyone knows, there was a huge campaign around the Olympics that Mia Farrow was one of the most outspoken advocates. There are ways to pressure the Chinese. One of those is to continue doing this divestment campaign. PetroChina is one of the largest companies in Sudan, and it's a national company. It's hitting the Chinese where it hurts, their wallets, because they need that oil, will influence their behavior, and it has. They have deployed a battalion of engineers. They have created a special envoy for Sudan. And then the other big thing is to use our political officials. This is something where, as both citizens directly by calling the White House or via our members of Congress, we pressure President Bush and Condoleezza Rice when they meet with their Chinese counterparts to say, in addition to trade and the environment, you also need to do better on Darfur. It's not a zero-sum game. You can still get oil and ensure you're not complicit in genocide by supporting the Chinese, the Sudanese. We just don't. We know that our government officials are not putting that within their key asks when they meet with their Chinese officials. And if it were, we would see behavioral change, which we are seeing on a small scale, largely because of people like us.
While we're on China, I'm going to use that as an excuse to segue over to a question we had in here about Burma and asking whether for you to give a very quick assessment of the state of play in Burma and your sense of how China feels about, is it an uneasy relationship supporting the junta? Yeah,
so the context is Darfur, not the only place where people are being targeted. We focus on 8 areas in the world where people are being targeted on a widespread, systematic way. And Eastern Burma is often cited as some work as awful as Darfur, where ethnic groups are being targeted. And again, here the Chinese have a very close relationship with the Burmese regime, where they get natural resources and provide them the military and diplomatic support. And the U.S. on this occasion has done a lot of things unilaterally. I think this goes back to just effective diplomacy. We're not saying it's a if or you can have oil or natural gas from Burma, and allow the regimes to commit mass atrocities, or it's one or the other. I think this comes with constructive engagement, but substantive engagement. The great example on this is with the Chinese were still involved in Sudan with the conflict in southern Sudan. The United States government, with the Bush administration, one of its amazing foreign policy successes was able to bring about a peace agreement between the North and the South without deploying one U.S. Marine, by us coordinating with our allies, using economic and diplomatic carrots and sticks, and we got a peace agreement that no one thought we would have gotten. But it was when we made it a priority. So if President Bush and his administration, and hopefully whoever is in the next administration, engages the Chinese and say, you can have natural resources without be complicit in human rights violations and mass atrocities. Let's talk about how we can do this. We can do this together because we need the Chinese to be constructive partners in this. And so that's we want to tell them they can have their cake and eat it too. They can have natural resources, good allies, good regional partners, and be more respectful of human rights.
You talked about the International Criminal Court's indictment of President Bashir of Sudan. What do you say to those who argue that by virtue of indicting him, the ICC has removed any motivation for the rebel groups to come together and negotiate and find a solution?
Yeah, again, a straw man in this peace versus justice paradigm. So many people say the indictment is compromising a peace agreement. We're saying you can, again, there's a way to have justice and peace. And the important thing is that the International Criminal Court has a clause called Article 16, which allows an indictment to be postponed for a year. It has to be voted on up to a year and voted on every time to postpone it. So this is a debate that our government is having, that our State Department is having with the British and the French and other Security Council members about, do we really think that the rebels and the Sudanese government will come to peace agreements if we postpone indicting President Bashir. All evidence that has shown in the past 5 years, when we have done numerous peace negotiations, that the government is not trustworthy and is not invested in peace agreements. They will bomb the venue where the rebels are trying to come together to get on the same page to sign a peace agreement. And so on the opposite end, we saw Charles Taylor from Liberia being indicted. And Liberia is now on a positive path towards peace and justice at the same time. It's not necessarily this if or. So it is possible to opt out for the indictment on Bashir. We don't think it should be done, but if it is done, it should be done with very concrete, measurable, and benchmarks that we can know that if they're not being respected, then we need to indict him.
I just have time for a few more questions. Let me just ask very quickly. You talked about the scorecards. Both of the presidential candidates are in the U.S. Senate. What kind of grades did they get?
Yeah. Obama has an A, McCain has a C. The important thing to note on this is the context, and that is some of the legislation. Unfortunately, with our Congress, we pass a lot of legislation that doesn't necessarily have substance to it. They're often called senses of Congress, where they sort of express their sentiment, their feeling, while there is legislation that has funding attached to it, or sanctions, or other teeth to just the bark, or bite with a bark. And so McCain and Obama have overall been relatively good on this issue. The analogy we use is stopping genocide is like building a bridge. You need to get to the other side. So if you have a beautifully well-engineered 3/4 of a bridge, who cares? You need to get to the other side. And so the question is not whether McCain or Obama or any other public official cares about genocide. They all care. No one is for genocide. No one is malicious. The question is whether they're going to make it a priority. And to date, we haven't seen either candidate say, this is going to be a priority, just like the Iraq war is going to be a priority, or just like the environment and green jobs. We haven't seen any candidate say, in my administration, I'm going to make never again mean something. And they're only going to say that if they hear from you.
We have a couple of organizational questions, and this one I think is the best single one. What's the single biggest mistake you've made running GNAT, and what did you learn from it?
I'm not telling. Single biggest mistake. Wow. I think it's try to turn a weakness into a strength here. I think, at the beginning, some of us made huge assumptions, like if you just tell people, they'll do something about it, or if you just say, contact your member of Congress, they'll do something about it. So we spent a lot of time and energy creating the scorecard and then just saying, hey, just go to the scorecard and use a scorecard. And then it took us months, maybe even close to a year, where people were saying, thanks for the scorecard, but I don't know how to contact my member of Congress, or I don't know who they are, or what to tell them. I'll just, please get an A. Like, they're not going to know what they're talking about. So this is where we then reflected and created 1-800-GENOCIDE, was because, again, you have to remove the barriers to entry. So I think the biggest mistake was making that assumption that, saying contact your congressman was enough information for people to take action, when it wasn't. We had to tell them, we had to do the phone number for them, tell them who their member of Congress was and what they had to do. So I think we lost on the mistake. I think we lost a lot of the potential when there was a lot of momentum in the Darfur movement to maximize that potential by making it even easier for people to take action.
And then the final question is that you are now, imagine yourself, you are President Mark Hanis. A third candidate has been written in at the last moment, and you are president. What are the top 3 steps that policy moves you would make?
Great question. I'll go specifically on Darfur right now. There's 3. We love 3s, and there are 3 Ps on what's going to end the atrocities in Darfur, and many of these 3 Ps can be applied to the atrocities in Congo and in Burma and in other places. And that is protection, peacemaking, and punishment. And so on the protection, we need to get from the 9,000 to the 26,000 peacekeepers ASAP. Make sure they have all the resources needed, make sure they have all the equipment. Second thing on the peacemaking is we need to bring all the rebel groups, because they keep on splintering, to come together, agree on a common platform, and then be successfully able to negotiate with the government. We need to find a political solution, because again, this is man-made. So we need to have a sustainable ceasefire to bring about the conclusion to this, so that people don't pick up the guns to go to address their grievances. They go to they use the rule of law. And the last one is punishment, and that's holding these people accountable. And that's continuing to allow the International Criminal Courts to investigate and prosecute those it deems most accountable, so we can send the signal to future genocidaires that there will be a cost to committing these atrocities. Because the scariest thing is during World War II, when someone asked Hitler, "How did you think you could get away with it?" And he said, "Who today remembers the Armenians?" He knew he could get away with it. And so we need to show that you can never get away with committing things like this. So those would be the three.
Please join me in thanking Mark Hanis.
Thank you.